At 4 o'clock on a freezing morning in 1932, a man stood in a line outside a factory gate that had not opened in weeks. There were 200 men in that line ahead of him, standing in the dark with their collars turned up, and every one of them knew the truth of it. If the gate opened at all, and it probably would not, there might be work for 3 of them. He had been doing this 5 mornings a week for 11 months. He had a wife at home and 3 children who thought their father still had a job because he could not bring himself to tell them otherwise. This was the thing that broke more men in the Great Depression than hunger ever did. They didn't have much, but they knew how to make it last. To understand that line in the dark, you have to understand the scale of what had happened. At the worst of it, in 1933, roughly 1 out of every 4 American workers had no job at all. Not fewer hours. No job. And there was no unemployment check waiting, because that system did not yet exist. When a man's work ended, his income ended that same day, completely, and there was nothing underneath him but whatever he had saved, which for most families was very little, and it went fast. So he did the only thing there was to do. He went out and looked. And what he found was that there were 200 other men doing exactly the same thing at every gate in town. The looking itself became the job, and it was brutal work. Men walked miles between factories because a streetcar fare was a luxury they could not justify. They stood in lines that formed before dawn and broke up by mid-morning with nothing given out. They learned the signs on the gates by heart, the ones that said no help wanted, no men wanted, do not ask. They went back to the same places week after week anyway, because you never knew, and because staying home was unbearable. And each time, a man had to walk back through his own front door with nothing and see his wife look up and shake his head and watch her keep her face steady for his sake. That walk home was the hardest few hundred steps in America in those years. And when the ordinary work ran out entirely, men did whatever there was. They sold apples on street corners, thousands of them, in 1930 and 1931, standing on the sidewalk beside a crate hoping to make $1 in a day. And many of those men in overcoats on the corners had been clerks and bookkeepers and salesmen a year earlier. They shoveled snow for the city when it snowed. They carried bags, painted fences, chopped wood, hauled ash, dug ditches, took anything for a day or an hour. There was no work beneath a man who had children to feed, and the pride that had once told him what he would and would not do was, by 1932, a luxury he had quietly set down somewhere along the way. Now, before this story goes on, answer something honestly, because this is where these years cut deepest. If you lost your work tomorrow and found nothing for a month, then 2, then 6, then a year, standing in lines and hearing no over and over, would you still be able to get up at 4 in the morning and go stand in that line again? Not for a week, for a year. Write yes or no in the comments right now before you read on. Then keep going, because what this did to people was not mainly about money at all. Because here is the thing we forget when we talk about these years. The deepest damage the Depression did to a working man was not to his stomach. It was to who he understood himself to be. In that time, a man's work was his identity and his standing and his worth in his own eyes. And when it was taken away, month after month, with no end in sight, something in him began to come apart. Men who had never in their lives failed at anything became convinced they had failed at everything. They grew quiet at their own tables. Some could not look their children in the eye. Some left the house every morning with a lunch pail and no job to go to, and walked the streets all day, and came home at the usual hour because keeping up the appearance of work was the last piece of himself he had left to hold on to. And this went on far longer than most people today realize. This was not a bad year. The unemployment of the Great Depression lasted, at terrible levels, for most of a decade. A man could look for work in 1930, 1931, 1932, and 1933, and still be looking. Families ran through their savings, then their possessions, then their relatives' patience. Beginning in 1933, the government finally began putting men to work directly on roads and dams and parks and public buildings, and for millions of families, those programs were the first steady money in years, and they were a lifeline. But even then, there were never enough places for everyone who needed one, and a great many men went on standing in lines at gates that stayed shut. So, what became of the man in that line in 1932 who could not bring himself to tell his children? Both endings were real, and they happened on the same street. Some of those men, one ordinary morning, after a year or 2 years of no, finally heard yes. The gate opened, a foreman pointed at him, and he worked that day and the next, and he walked home in the evening with a job again and could not speak for the relief of it, and he never once took a day's work for granted for the rest of his life. And other men never heard yes at all in those years. They stood in the lines until the lines stopped forming and the looking hollowed them out, and some of them never fully came back to themselves, and their families carried that quiet sadness for decades afterward without ever quite talking about it. That is the part of the Great Depression we should be most careful never to romanticize. It is easy, from a distance, to admire the toughness of men who got up at 4 a.m. for a year to stand in the cold for a job that was not there. And it was extraordinary, and we should honor it. But it was not noble suffering, and it was not character building, and not one of those men would have chosen a minute of it. It was an economy that had failed, grinding down decent people who had done everything right, and taking from many of them something they never entirely got back. The strength was real. So was the damage. They were the hard years. They didn't have much, but they knew how to make it last. And that's worth remembering. If your father or your grandfather looked for work in those years, tell me in the comments what he did to keep going. I want to know what your family carried through it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we go back inside the hardest years America ever faced and the quiet courage of the people who lived through them.